Hi, this is Josh Kulp for Daf Shevui. We are learning Masechet Avodah Zarah, Daf Memhe, page 45. An apology and an explanation before I begin. I was sort of caught off guard in making this video. I have to do it by today. Today is Yom HaZikaron in Israel. Tomorrow is Yom HaTzmaut, so happy birthday to Israel on their 70th birthday. And I happen to be sitting at a coffee shop, and it is extremely loud here. So I'm not sure if you're hearing this video well, but if you are not hearing it perfectly well, it's because Israel is such a vibrant society that on a mid-morning Wednesday afternoon, you can see a little bit. This is the scene at Aroma in Modi'in. I am drinking a cup of coffee and working on Daf Shevui, where I've worked on it all over the world, in coffee shops, in breweries, you name it, airports. I've worked on Daf Shevui. All right, sorry for that little tidbit of where I am. The Mishnah on Daf Memhe is a very interesting Mishnah, and basically it states that natural features such as mountains and rivers, anything that's attached to the ground cannot become prohibited even if it is worshipped by a non-Jew. And there are three different midrashim on that, and it can shows you the fact that there are three different midrashim proving that mountains, rivers, etc. do not become idols even if they're worshipped, shows you the sense of importance of the rabbis attributed to this. There is one exception, and we're going to talk about that in the continuation, and that is the Asherah tree, the worshipped tree. But I wanted to just dwell for a moment or two on the notion that natural things, unless there is human labor involved in it, natural things do not become idols. There is a similarity between that and the rules of tuma, impurity. For something to be susceptible to impurity, it has to have had human labor involved in it. It can't just be raw material. So unfashioned wood, even if it's been cut down from the tree, cannot become impure. It has to be turned into something of use. Impurity, if you will, is something only involved in the human realm and not in the natural realm, although there are some natural sources of impurity, and I don't want to get into impurity too much. It's when it comes to idolatry, the rules are similar, not exactly the same, but they are similar. And I think it's almost as if saying, look, people can't really worship something that is part of the natural world. The natural world is God's creation, and it doesn't really matter what people do to it. They can worship it, they can bow down to it. It's still part of God's creation, and it doesn't become prohibited to use. It doesn't become something that we should abhor just because somebody worships it. An interesting question. I'm not an expert on paganism. I'm not a pagan. But I wonder, did pagans believe, for instance, that mountains and rivers were gods? Or did they worship these places because these were places that they thought the gods lived, or they could find divine forces, but not that the actual mountain, river, sun, moon, stars were actually in themselves physically gods? My impression is more to the latter, that they thought that these places were not gods in and of themselves, but that they were places where divine presences could be found. So I think it's an interesting discussion that gets to the heart of how do the rabbis conceive of idolatry. There's some technical kind of midrashic kind of discussion on this daf. There is a long discussion on sipuye hahar, things that are used to cover the mountain. I don't really know what these are, but throughout this daf and really the next couple dapim, the rabbis are asking, how fashioned does something have to be? How much human labor has to be involved with something for it to become susceptible to becoming an idol? Or in other words, like how separate, how different from natural features does something have to be for it to be considered an idol? Follows a long discussion about the tree. I noted that the tree was one exception. It is a natural feature that does become prohibited if it's worshipped. The question is asked, what if the tree is planted as a normal tree, in other words, without idolatrous intentions, and only then is worshipped? Does that tree essentially become an idol, or is it something that was planted and it's sort of set in motion to become a tree by being planted, and therefore cannot become prohibited if it's worshipped later. Does an Asherah, an idolatrous tree, have to be worshipped from the outset? And then finally, the daf ends with a remarkable source. It ends with a bunch of verses that talk about eradicating idolatry, which we've talked about before. And it ends with a remarkable interpretation that eradicating idolatry doesn't mean physically destroying it, but it means renaming it, giving it a different name, perhaps a disgraceful name, or at least some kind of other different name, which I think is sort of very emblematic of two things. One is the rabbi's notion that the way we think of things, the way we call things, language is essentially part of what that thing is. When you call something, it becomes that thing. If you call an idolatrous place something else besides its original idolatrous name, you're in a sense eradicating it by language. And it's also emblematic of sort of the rabbis as being a disempowered people who did not have the physical power to go out and destroy the idols which were saturating their world. What did they have the power to do? They had the power to talk, to name, to consider, to think. Other people can tell me what I can do, but they can't tell me what I can think. My thoughts are my own, and therefore I'm free to sort of rename an idolatrous place what I would like to rename it. So that's a few thoughts. I think it's a fascinating page. Rabbis' thoughts on idolatry are fascinating. It tells us a lot about their world and the world in which they live. And I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, please make comments on our Daf Shevui on Facebook.